I think we need to understand Argentina's response to debt crisis in two phases. There was what I call the first phase, which is actually responding to the 1980s debt crisis in the 1990s by Carlos Menem, who followed a kind of IMF formula, a kind of policy recipe in response, which is a bit like Greece is today, with the Troika. So we're talking here about dealing with debt by borrowing from the IMF, but on the condition that structural adjustment policies are enacted, on the condition that kind of moves are made to privatise industry, that wages are slashed, welfare and safety nets are taken away, privatisations take place en masse. And this is what happened in Argentina in the 1990s in the first phase. Plus, you also had a situation where Argentina was using what's called the convertibility model. So the currency, the Argentinian peso, the value of it was actually tied to the US dollar. So Argentina had a very a strong currency. And what that meant was, whilst it brought inflation down, it meant two things. On the one hand, it meant a loss of competitiveness for Argentina's exports on world markets. And on the other hand, it led to a kind of series of trade deficits. So Argentina's debt, rather than kind of being reduced, was actually increasing throughout the 1990s, up to the point where, and coupled with this, you had increased inflation, you had stalled growth towards the end of the 90s and so on, actually led to a fully fledged debt default at the end of 2001 to the tune of $93 billion.
And can I just ask you really quickly, what were some of the consequences of that debt default immediately afterwards and on ordinary Argentinian people?
So, well, the immediate debt default in 2001, the consequences were quite they were quite tremendous in the first few months. This is a very important point to make. That the first few months, perhaps a year, during 2002, was a very difficult year for Argentinians. 7 million people became impoverished, mainly from the middle class. Argentina's kind of macroeconomic statistics actually were very similar to Greece's are right now. So, for instance, 1 in 4 people were left unemployed. Growth detracted by a fifth, which is similar figures to Greece since the first bailout in 2010, all the kind of austerity measures. And basically, there was misery, but it was only for a very short time, because the second phase, what I was calling the second phase, which is Argentina's post-2001 recovery and how the government actually initiated that, was the opposite to Carlos Menem's austerity measures and the opposite of kind of Greek austerity measures that are being imposed by the IMF now. So Argentina defaulted, and instead, what the government did was, through a kind of combination of export-led recovery, because the peso, the value of the peso fell after it left the dollar peg, became very weak, which meant that demand for exports in Argentina and world markets increased very strongly, maintaining a stable but competitive exchange rate, and importantly, policies that stimulated internal demand. So, for instance, spending money on social programs for the most vulnerable groups, the unemployed, increasing wages for trade unions and organised labour, all these kind of things, and wealth redistribution generally, stimulated the economy such that by 2003 Argentina was enjoying growth of 9%, and growth continued at about this, the same rate for another 5 or 6 years until 2008, and Argentina became the fastest growing economy in the West.
So staying with Argentina just for a second, I know in one of your recent op-eds you mentioned various citizens initiatives. Can you just sort of expand a little bit on some of these citizen initiatives?
Sure. I think the lesson to come out of this is that Greek people do not have to necessarily fear default. It doesn't have to be a bad thing, because in the long term it can actually be a very good thing if a number of factors combined take place. So, for instance, obviously it's important to have a supportive government. The Greek people have that now. Unlike Argentina post-2001, until 2003, until Nestor Kirchner's election, the Greeks have a kind of a left-wing government in Syriza that has shown through rejecting the Troika's measures, through rejecting the demands to slash pensions, slash public sector wages further, increase VAT on medicines and that kind of thing, that they have a government that will support the most vulnerable sectors, will support labour, will support general society rather than supporting financial institutions and the banks. One of the most important things that Greeks will need to do if they were to go into default, and if they were to leave the euro, which might not necessarily even happen, even if there is a default, it doesn't mean that they will leave the euro. Although if they do, then the prospects for an export-led recovery are there. Is to actually come together like the Argentinians did post 2001. The most incredible thing about the post-2001 situation for me in Argentina was just how resilient the people were, just how creative they were, and just how much solidarity was expressed in society out of necessity in the first instance.
And what can you just share a few examples of that kind of?
Yeah. So, for instance, Argentina in 2002, it became a kind of incubator for some really impressive and radical experiments in participatory democracy, in kind of the solidarity economy, in horizontalism, so removing leadership, basically taking decisions together as communities in a society at all different levels. So, for instance, there was a creation of many what they call neighbourhood assemblies. So these are kind of citizens and neighbours coming together, middle class, working class, shantytown dwellers in the Argentinian case, coming together in urban centres, discussing the political issues of the day and allocating resources in a time of necessity locally from basically to those who needed it most in a fair and democratic way. Another movement that was very impressive in Argentina was the Barter Club movement. Literally millions of Argentinians, when the money dried up, when the IMF pulled the loans out and abandoned Argentina, just as the Troika have done in Greece, how did society adapt and respond? It adapted and responded surprisingly well. Millions of people joined barter clubs, exchanged kind of goods, if you like, specialised in what they were good at producing: food, clothes, creating clothes, second-hand clothes, exchanging those, giving haircuts, providing English lessons, whatever it was, exchanging them in the absence of money, instead using a kind of barter credit system in its place. And this operated very successfully for at least a year. Another movement that was particularly impressive, and if you like, the Argentinian movement has become a kind of cause celebre throughout the world, is its worker recovered companies movement. So when you're in a default situation, when you're in a crisis situation like Argentina was, obviously in many cases companies can't survive, they go bankrupt. In Argentina's case, many of the bosses actually abandoned the country, fled with the money that they had left, fled with the kind of resources that were left in the factories, and so on, and left.
So
workers left unemployed. Often they were left with kind of a huge backlog of wages owed to them. And so what did they do? They responded by actually taking over the factories, going back into the factories, back into the hospitals, back into the hotels, taking them over, running them as worker cooperatives without the bosses, and doing it very, very successfully. And there are some 350 cases of that in Argentina today. Almost all of them have survived and thrived, even thrived since then.
So it sounds like what I hear you saying is that with a combination of sound counter-cyclical macroeconomic policies, as well as combined with really, really innovative citizens initiatives, right, such as the ones you just mentioned, is really what helped Argentina sort of in this post-2000 default recovery period, right?
One of the main reasons why Argentinians were able to come through, despite a painful year in 2002, was precisely this combination. But, as I said, the Greeks have the benefit of a supportive government that's supporting the social movements in order to do this. The first thing that Alex Tsipras did after he was elected, one of the first things, a week after he was elected, he went and visited the Viami factory in Greece that has been recovered by the workers themselves, to express his solidarity and to say, we in power are going to support the Greek workers, the Greek working class, we're going to support your movement that's starting to grow as well. And so I think things could potentially have the potential to be quite exciting in Greece after a period of after a painful time, for actually to come through the light at the end of the tunnel in the Greek case.
Great, Daniel. Well, like I said, this has all been really, really interesting, and definitely appreciate you spending time and speaking with me, and just want to thank all of our viewers out there for joining us at Telesaur.